Handling Great Enemy and Servant of Narvaka was a difficult thing to approach, but the Ch.32 approached it like they did everything else, by identifying the issues and assigned each issue to one of the industry sections of the government and culture of the Ch.32. First, the high-tech equipment should always be considered live. Even if it did not have power, even if it was critically damaged to the point where the only intact section was the strange, nearly unworkable metal alloy, it was to be considered to be fully operational. All equipment and relics were to be considered to be dangerous just by their presence. The relics and equipment should be considered able to intrude on any unsecure network, able to break any encryption. It should be considered able to do tasks and perform operations that the Ch.32 had not thought of. The first solution was isolation. Each piece would be examined separately, with large air gaps and vacuum gaps to prevent stray electromagnetic impulses from moving from one research area to another. All computer systems were to be sealed and secured network, limited only to the task on hand. All life support would be controlled locally, analog when possible. Lights would be analog. Doors would be mechanical only. As few computer systems as possible. When computer systems had to be used, they would be proprietary operating systems, ROM encoded if possible. As little RAM as possible, with a dedicated OS utilizing it differently each time. It had been difficult. The various industries brought on board had to go backwards as far as technology was concerned in order to meet the stringent requirements. Every industry was careful to put forth their best efforts, unwilling to lose face in participating in the project with substandard goods, materials, or protocols. Eventually, what was designed was a long box, each entirely self-sufficient, each modular, capable of working alone or matched together with others. An entirely new spacecraft was designed to carry the research boxes, and all new craft were designed to move between the boxes. Copper and gold wiring was returned to, as well as moving from molecular circuitry back to metal over silicon. Still, each industry felt pride in their own accomplishments and their own contributions to the project. Children wore torso garments of the rough-appearing spacecraft and the analog spacesuits that would be used to researchers. The theology industry blessed each one, ensuring the proper engravings were placed on appropriate surfaces. 25 ships were commissioned, finishing under budget and ahead of schedule. The self-contained laboratories and research facilities were built rapidly, under budget, and several times the Ch.32 started over as improvements were developed during the manufacturing and building process. The small ships were built and attached, undergoing several improvements. The public loved it. Ch.32 watched the info streams showing smiling workers coming off shift after finishing their work and approved greatly. Songs and media lauded those workers' dedication. The industries that made up the governments felt that there was enough glory and enough prestige for every industry. Corporations were formed, combined, dissolved, or suspended as needed. There was no reason to indulge in empire building. There was status and profit for all. The transports arrived in the system and dropped off the self-contained laboratories, then went back to gather more. Workers built the lattice that the containers would be placed within, each cube within the lattice shielded from EM scatter. Each cube was designed to be self-destructed by two systems, one that could be activated from within, one that could be activated from the outside. Both were analog and completely cut out from any other system. Research and science teams were assigned their cubes. Each was allotted a single radio channel, using the analog AM radio system only. The Ch.32 set to work. First, the archaeologists of the research and science industries had to approve the retrieval of Great Enemy or Servant of Narvaka relics. Familiar-looking relics were prioritized in order to examine whether or not the technology, which the Ch.32 barely understood, was consistent with other sites. Once a relic was determined to be fully catalogued and recorded, the relic was removed by remote probes, controlled by dedicated OS and hardware and guided by analog AM systems, the entire process overseen by the archaeologists who had the authority to pause or stop the retrieval at any time for any reason. The researchers and scientists knew that the planet was the site of a battlefield, and thus every single thing should be treated as about to explode. The relics had been designed with only warfare in mind, and that meant destroying things and taking lives while protecting your own. The weapons were obvious, for the most part, even though they were unfamiliar. There was only so many ways to make a weapon. Again, the great enemy seemed to favor kinetic weapons across the board. When great enemy weapons were first found, the Ch.32 had scoffed at the kinetic weapons. After all, even experiments with superconductor rails has shown that kinetic weapons were inferior to energy weapons thanks to superdense capacitor gel. Still, the Ch.32 were meticulous if anything, and they had carefully examined the great enemy kinetic weaponry. As the theology industry put it, the technology was so advanced as to be magic to the point that the Ch.32 had to discover science to invent tools to discover science to invent tools to discover science to invent the tools to build the equipment just to examine the great enemy equipment in order to find out that everything the Ch.32 knew about science was wrong, and now new science had to be devised. The advances in superconductors, unipole magnets, variable polarity magnetism, electromagnetism that were discovered just examining damaged weaponry proved the theology industry correct, as the Ch.32 slowly devised the science and invented the tools they needed for each step. The armors had always provided interesting advances in technology, but the new armor seemed to have additional discoveries just waiting for researchers. The Ch.32 were always careful to avoid applying power to any unknown mechanisms. Applying power was only done in final stages, before the mechanisms were slated to be disassembled for further research, and even then it was only done under tightly controlled circumstances. The relics were dangerous. That was obvious to anyone. So the Ch.32 took precautions. We to his friends, was one of the defense industry's specially trained experts in combat application. He was also an anomaly in Ch.32 society. While he was an atheist, who did not believe in anything divine, that was uncommon but still not unusual in Ch.32 society. He was unusual in that the sight of the images of Narvaka's servants instilled a deep disgust in him. He was also a murderer. While crimes of passion were not unheard of, as the Ch.32 were a passionate people, we had not killed in the heat of passion, in self-defense, or by accident. He had plotted, planned, and executed the Ch.32 who had engaged in adultery with his spouse, as well as his spouse. Well, he had executed his spouse after setting the severed head of the other male on the kitchen table. Unlike the majority of those who murdered, he was unrepentant, stating that he would do it again and again in the same circumstances. At any other time in history, he would have been relegated to a home for the criminally insane. Perhaps even had gene therapy or neurosurgery performed on him, but history had aligned in such a way as to present a different option for him. He had been moved from the custody of the justice industry to the defense industry. There, he had joined others who had committed murder, learning more efficient and proper ways to kill others. He had been taught demolitions, how to do a spacewalk, how to operate the mechanisms of the research blocks, and trained extensively on his primary weapons. A curved metal blade, a sword from history. We liked the sword. After all, he'd crafted an object much like it to hack off the male's head. The other thing was a simple percussion-driven kinetic weapon, a ballistic weapon that was effective even in vacuum with an oxygen cylinder attached. Unlike most demolitions courses, his was not full of exotic detonators, radios, and complex explosives. He was trained on plastic explosive and a type of cable that burned so quickly that it was basically explosive. He learned to wrap the plastic explosive blocks with a cable, put a knot on one side, then spool out the explosive cord before detonating the whole thing. The zero-gravity vacuum work was the hardest. He had excelled at it all. Where others fell by the wayside, he came out the other side of every bit of training even more skilled. Out of nearly 10,000 applicants, he was the top of his graduating class of 215. Out of his graduating classmates, he was one of only 6 that the sight of the servants of Narvaka filled him with disgust. No, more than disgust. He felt the same hatred for that visage as he had felt when he had witnessed, with his own eyes, the betrayal of his wife and his best friend from childhood. The raw, burning hatred that filled his mind with fluting screams of rage and fury. The same fluting rage that he had hammered into a cold blade as he had made his plans and attended classes to learn to forge metal, so he could craft the blade to cut off his betrayers' heads with his own 2 hands, was now brought to the forefront by training. He had proven he could plan through such neck-fluting rage. He was then trained through it, which left him the next phase of training. Sci-industry had determined that the crystals were psionic in nature, that both sides used psionics on the battlefield. Psychic dampeners and psychic shields were devised. For most Shretarowa, the psychic defenses gave them tunnel vision, caused heart palpitations, and even more physical problems, not to mention difficulty thinking. When the psychic dampener was put over Wee's head and activated, he gave a fluting roar of rage, lunged up, and nearly killed the technician before 8 defense industry workers, in full armor and armed with stunners, had pulled Wee off of the unlucky worker. Workers from the theology industry worked with Wee and the 5 others who had such extreme reactions. Mantras, exercises, prayers, all of them stripped of religion and more metaphysical than theological. Sci-industry developed a psychic shield and dampener just for Wee and his 5 companions. They were trained further. Hand-to-hand skills, heavy weapons, more demolitions. Many times they had to perform their tasks while exposed to servant of Narvaka images and crystals, learning to push down and hammer into cold hard steel the fluting rage that those images instilled, ignoring the devices that pounded at their minds with commands to obey. Once it was done, they were sent with the flotilla to the archaeological site. In their own vessel, it was heavily shielded against psionics. There were meditation chambers, null psi chambers, exercise chambers, and more. The vessel was parked away from the lattice. The vessel was built as analog as possible, with computers as crude as possible. In many places they used micro-vacuum tubes rather than metal over silicon. We was put in charge of the other 5. He drilled them mercilessly but fairly. He admitted to mistakes and invited his subordinates to correct or exceed him. They practiced boarding the lattice. They practiced zero-G combat. They even got permission to go down to the planet and practice combat within the gravity well of the planet. He requested and eventually received permission, once the tests were done, to have his men practice beneath that alien sun without even a respirator. Lungs heaving, neck slits fluttering, sweat dripping from their skin, clad only in a rude loincloth, practicing fighting one another, practicing with their weapons, practicing movement and maneuver. We drew up the plans and received approval to have his men practice with simulated injuries, while intoxicated or otherwise impaired, and we even had them practice beyond the normal safe exercise period of 6 hours. The representatives of the defense industry watched and fluted their approval even as they nodded. Yes, we was worth the investment should anything go wrong. After all, the Shretarowa were careful. Narvaka's 8th warning. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Any industry leader, board member, or even corporate worker knew that Narvaka's 8th warning applied even more to advanced technology. But the Shretarowa were not so in love with technology that they forgot about how muscle power, sweat, blood, and determination had allowed their species to become the dominant one of their planet. Narvaka's 3rd law: a good day's labor reaps rewards to the patient. That was why Wee's request to engage in practice in the surf of the large continent was almost absently rubber-stamped. Only a few defense industry supervisors watched, mostly out of boredom, as we led his assets into practice. Running on the sand. Running through the surf. practice fighting in the sand and surf, firing their weapons in the surf, even swimming in the ocean water, overcoming the Ch.32 instinct to start screaming if the water was over their ankles. The defense industry representatives had watched in horror as we and his assets had learned to swim in the surf, to the point of diving beneath the water for as long as 90 whole seconds. There was a morbid fascination among the defense industry reps as they watched we and his team swim in the ocean and work underwater. Equipment was designed at We's request, difficult equipment to imagine, much less design. But We's assets were equipped and then trained on gear that would allow them to work underwater for up to hours at a time. To guard their very souls, the theological industry selected 2 of their number who felt anger and disgust at viewing the servants of Narvaka, who often argued what some would consider blasphemy, and sent them down to train with We and his assets. Morbid curiosity and then vicarious terror had the defense industry representatives watching We and his assets develop underwater techniques to weld, to move, to perform many actions. The defense industries took to calling We and his assets demo frogs in official memos. The label caught on with the populace back home at Narvaka's gift, who watched the videos excitedly as We and his men trained and worked beneath the waves. They felt a sense of right as we invented what came to be called underwater demolitions using that explosive cord and the plastique. When the islands were discovered, we applied with the archaeologists and researchers to move his operations to one of the islands. To be honest, the archaeologists agreed more to see how his demo frogs operated on an island than any real reason. We quickly gained permission to build a base and had one of the research boxes brought down via dropship and placed. Some defense industry representatives and executive officers found it more than slightly amusing that an unrepentant multiple murderer was in charge of millions of gold certificates worth the equipment, 5 other Ch.32, and could request equipment to be designed and manufactured. The images of We's demo frogs swimming around coral reefs, surrounded by bright fish and phosphorus bioluminescent seaweed, was breathtaking to the researchers and the public alike. When the imagery of the visage of the servant of Narvaka was transmitted to We, he had his men retreat to the frog den and resume meditation. Psychic shielding was activated, and we tested just how high power his men could tolerate. The feed of the probes was fed to the frog den, and we watched, upper elbows on his mid-thigh, fingers laced beneath his chin, his assets behind him watching intently. He paused frequently, asking his assets to identify critical demolition points. He brought up the acoustical mapping of the underwater facility and had his men drill as if they were assaulting it to blow it up. Working and training hard in the harsh sunlight, on the white sands of the beach, psychic shielding in their helmets cranked to the max, exhausted and breathing hard, their vision tunneled by fatigue and the shielding, they trained to assault the underwater labyrinth and destroy it. The visuals of the tube fascinated We and his demo frogs. It sparked an idea in the mind of one of his men, and he sent the idea up to the fabrication units in orbit. 2 days later the idea was realized and delivered. A small cylinder, carrying additional atmospheric tanks, an inline propeller motor designed for minimum cavitation, as well as compartments for other supplies. It would allow the demo frogs to move great distances underwater without exhausting themselves. The probe found open air, and we watched closely, making sure he had the acoustical maps forwarded to him on plastic-covered paper so that he could mark on them with grease pencils. He hung them up even as he kept one eye on the crude monitor showing the interior as the probes explored the labyrinth. Something had caused the great enemy to assault what we had taken to calling the ocean facility in a frenzy. While he had never actually been in combat, we felt he had enough practice and simulation to recognize that the attack by the great enemy had left behind markings that spoke of a furious assault. He felt a kinship with the fury. When he inquired of his men, they all agreed. They too felt a kinship with that fury. As days passed, he had his assets practice inhibited by rage-inducing drugs, fighting through the rage, focusing it, pounding it into steel. Your rage is your bulwark. We yelled out, his neck slits vibrating with his commands. "Your fury is your shield, frog brothers." The representative from the theological industry, now called frog priests, joined the training, helping advance the mantras and meditation techniques. We called for a rest and had his men retreat for meditation and counseling, ordering them to write letters home, to fans if they had no family, and to move around one another, reaffirming their bonds of brotherhood. The frog priests heard their confessions and gave advice and solace. We himself was watching the monitor when the probe entered the vast chamber. The sight of the servant instilled disgust, nausea, and bone-deep fury. He reached over and slapped the button to crank the psychic shielding to the maximum as the red fluting rage filled him. The shielding instantly spun up to full load, nearly 5 times what any other Ch.32 could even survive. The demo frogs and frog priests felt their teeth tingle, felt the taste of blood in their mouths, and immediately moved quickly and efficiently toward the armory, just as they had all drilled. We saw the servant's eyes open. His lips curled strangely, a predator's snarl on an herbivore's face. He heard it, a whisper, barely audible. "You belong to me." We and his frogs all jerked upright. "Never!" They all fluted at once. One of the frog priests shouted it, and the shout was picked up. "Your fury is your bulwark." The universe liked that.